It's been 1 year since Russia began its invasion of Ukraine. Now, while a war in Europe may seem far away from Africa, the impact has been felt by many across the continent of Africa. We asked some in Kenya and Nigeria how the war has affected them.
It has affected me emotionally because I have a friend over there. When we talked it was last 2 weeks, he says other Nigerian citizens that are there, that they are suffering due to the war, that the war is severe.
It's needless. It's needless, and it's a senseless war.
Food prices have really gone up. Looking back from the fertilizer prices, they have gone up, making food become such a scarce commodity.
The cost of living has become very high. You'll see, for example, the fuel, it has highly risen. Many people are finding it hard to afford this. It has become very tough for most of the border drivers, the taxi drivers.
Several students of Nigerian origin, were out there schooling, and they had to, their schooling journey had to be cut short. It's a loss for them.
We'll be looking at all the issues raised in a bit, starting with the impact of the war on wheat consumers in Africa. Now, in 2020 alone, some African countries imported up to 80% of their wheat from either Ukraine or Russia. Kenya, for example, used to import a third of its total wheat supply from the two warring nations. But now, wheat producers and consumers are feeling the effects of war. Our correspondent, Felix Maringa, filed this report from Kenya.
This is Jim Floor Bakery in Kawangware, one of Nairobi's informal settlements. Before the war, they used to bake up to 7,000 mandazis, bread rolls and buns here daily. But with the Ukraine war, wheat prices doubled. Deliveries were delayed, quantities decreased, and the baked items were reduced in size. The bakery and its staff had to make drastic changes to stay afloat.
We had to go several days without working. So if we were working for 6 days, now you find we are working for 3 to 4 days. Yeah. So units obviously they had to reduce, and some employees are not under payment because we do daily payments, daily wages as part of payments.
For wheat farmer Michael, just 3 hours to the west of Nairobi, the wheat shortage combined with higher prices would normally have meant increased income. But that was not the case, as he depended on fertilizer supply from Ukraine and Russia.
Initially, we used to buy a 50-kilogram bag of fertilizer at 2,800 shillings, but in the recent past, we have been buying the same 50-kilogram bag at 6,300 shillings. So even if the buyers are coming in plenty, the cost of production is too high, and as a result, the profit margins have become very little.
With over 40% of wheat supply in Africa coming from Russia and Ukraine, experts say it's time Africa stopped relying on food from outside the continent and found alternative means to feed her most vulnerable people. Economist Exen Iraqi says that African countries should learn lessons from this crisis and make changes.
We would want the government to do more so that we have things like strategic oil reserves. We have things like strategic grain reserves. We would also want the countries in the country in future to diversify the source of their food, so that we don't just get wheat from Ukraine. We can get wheat from Argentina. So we must also make farming cool, so that people are proud of it. And the only way to do that is to give it support. Whether it is banks, whether it's the government, whether it's research institutes, we need to give support to farmers.
Over the past year, Africans have had to face the high price of their dependence on wheat from Ukraine and Russia. A wake-up call to how a far-away war can hit close to home.
And it has hit close to home indeed. Many analysts say that geopolitically, the war in Ukraine has fed into a Cold War-like scenario, a global power struggle between Russian and Western powers playing out on the continent. The pressure is on to take a side.
In a case, you see justice and injustice, an aggressor and a victim. Neutrality is not an option, because then you are standing on the side of the aggressor.
But some African governments would rather seek a political position that works for them at home and abroad. In the latest vote at the UN General Assembly, 15 African nations abstained from a resolution that calls for Russia to end hostilities in Ukraine and withdraw its forces. That's nearly half of all the abstentions. So why is that? Our correspondent Mariel Mueller looks at some of the possible reasons to choose non-alignment.
Africa as a continent has experienced more than enough invasion itself. So why would so many countries refuse to condemn Russia on this? Let's look at some potential factors. Money is not a major factor. Russia accounts for less than 1% of the foreign direct investment going to the continent. But there's one area where Russian involvement in Africa really stands out: weapons. Russia was the largest arms dealer to African countries in these past years, supplying 44% of all arms imports to the continent. A combination of friendship and military support with historical roots which run deep.
These relations were formed at a very pivotal historical moment for the continent, when many countries were emerging out of their colonial master's reach. Moscow, the former Soviet Union, was a very supportive partner to many African states, to many liberation movements. More importantly, the Soviet Union provided arms.
The Kremlin-linked mercenary group Wagner sends fighters to countries across the continent. The US called it a proxy force of Russia's defense ministry, carrying out missions strategic to Moscow. This was most recently seen in Mali. The Malian military junta invited the Wagner group into the country to take on Islamist militants. The mercenaries replaced unpopular French troops, but have since been accused of carrying out massacres, killing hundreds of civilians. Russian mercenaries could be heading to Burkina Faso next. France says it's pulling out its troops from there too. And Wagner liaison officers have already reportedly been seen in the country. Burkina Faso wasn't even in the room for that UN vote. Rising public opinion against Western presence has been swayed by targeted Russian disinformation, the US State Department says.
Russia's intensified application of disinformation and the use of the Wagner Group across Africa has spread a trail of lies and human rights abuses. These actors continue operating in Africa, exploiting turbulent situations through disinformation to sway public support for the Russian government to expand its influence.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov toured Africa 3 times in the last 8 months, taking with him a strong message.
We know that American, British and other European delegations regularly appear in Africa and demand African countries not cooperate with the Russian delegation, by which the West understands the restoration, by and large, of colonial dependencies in a new form.
That idea of the West having colonialist designs chimes with unease in many African capitals. Feelings that they are subject to double standards and a patronizing attitude. South Africa is currently hosting Russia and China for joint naval exercises. The US has criticized the timing over the anniversary of Russia invading Ukraine. But the South African defense minister told NPR that South Africa wanted respect for its decisions and its wishes. It also abstained in the UN vote against Russia. The Ukraine war shows how African countries are on a tightrope between acting independently while at the same time keeping the allies they want and need.
To help us understand the position of some African countries who abstained from condemning Russia for its war in Ukraine, I am now joined by Felix Maringa, foreign policy and geopolitics expert based in Pretoria, South Africa. Hello, Felix. Thanks for joining us. Now, South Africa did not condemn Russia. How do you justify that?
Thank you, Eddie. Let us first of all consider that as we are marking the 1 year of the Russia-Ukraine war, South Africa's position on the conflict can be discerned through a range of developments. And I think the most important starting point in this regard was the vote that we saw shortly after the Russia began what it called its special military operation in March 22 at the United Nations General Assembly, in which we saw South Africa then abstaining in the vote to condemn Russia's aggression. Interestingly, when you look at the comments that South Africa's permanent representative to the UN, in her remarks, highlighted the fact that South Africa's position was informed by largely the fact that the Russia-Ukraine war, the kind of oversized attention that had been given to the Russia-Ukraine war at the expense of other crisis situations across the world that had seized the United Security Council. So largely it was calling out on that fact of what one can call it hypocrisy and double standards, but also on the other hand, it was urging more for a Pacific settlement to disputes. So this idea of where has peace gone, in fact, in the bigger scheme or in the unfolding of conversation. So trying to turn attention away from the bellicose rhetoric that surrounded the immediate onset of the war.
Okay, so I hear you, all that is understood, but some are just thinking, why is it so difficult? We're talking about one country using force to invade another country to claim territory. This is against the UN Charter. So why make excuses? Why is it so difficult to say, Russia, you did the wrong thing by invading Ukraine?
I can turn the question back to you. The same question can be asked of the coalitions of the willing in the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which also amounted to a contravention of international law. So stemming from that perspective of where if you want to label some interventions illegal and others not, then we begin to now get into the territory of double standard. This is particularly the issue that has been raised by a number of countries in the global south who have questioned the kind of geopolitical rendering that has surrounded the Russia-Ukraine war. So this double standard issue is one that in a sense has reawakened the principle of non-alignment. And just as a historical background, the non-alignment movement was particularly resonant during the Cold War years. It was this idea of the global South countries, over 100 countries, saying they don't want to be pawns in the Cold War between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc. And I think as a matter of clarification, South Africa's position is not primarily neutrality. I think it's better framed using the term of strategic non-alignment.
I mean, at the end of the day, there were two sides. You can either condemn Russia for invading Ukraine, or you can stay on the fence, or you can say, no, Russia did not forcefully invade Ukraine, which will be a very interesting side. Let me bring you to this point. Germany's Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, recently made this statement, and I quote, in a case you see justice and injustice, an aggressor and a victim, neutrality is not an option because then you're standing on the side of the aggressor. Is that a fair statement? It seems to suggest with this statement that South Africa is supporting Russia's invasion of Ukraine. What do you say to that?
Again, it brings me back to the various levels of analysis that one can apply to the war. So in one sense, there's been a great sense of opposition by countries like South Africa to the idea of being pressured into taking a stance. The idea of non-alignment by its very nature is a justifiable foreign policy stance by all accounts. So when countries in the collective West through such statements seem to suggest that they almost want to use certain levers to push countries into taking stance, it sort of begins to put a dent on the question of foreign policy independence. And I think that's where a lot of global South countries like South Africa are pushing back against. They essentially don't want to be lectured at when it comes to articulating some of their positions on very weighty geopolitical matters such as the Russia-Ukraine war. So it's a matter of asserting your foreign policy position and letting the other actors on the international arena take your word for it.
Okay, so to rub salt in the wound, South Africa is holding joint military drills in the Indian Ocean with Russia and China. Isn't that a bit insensitive, as you said earlier, Ukraine's marking a year of the war with Russia?
I mean, how insensitive, in my view, I don't consider it insensitive at all. In fact, it's part of the normal routine of diplomatic activities when you look at military diplomacy and the kind of multi-sectoral cooperation that we see across various countries. So by and by, it's largely part of diplomatic engagements, in the same way that a lot of countries in the collective West also choose who to conduct their military activities and military exercises with. I think South Africa should be accorded the same sense of freedom of choice in determining who it wants to conduct military diplomacy with. On the question of insensitivity, it's a question of whose viewpoint you're considering. For South Africa, the military diplomacy is part of the whole trust building and forging stronger cooperations with its strategic partners, as the same as any other country would look to in terms of using the various instruments of its foreign policy.
Okay, you're clearly looking at it from a point of view as South Africa, as a sovereign nation, can make a decision on its own. So you don't feel like you need to be coerced into making a decision. Some still would argue that at the end of the day, this is something bad that has happened. Why not condemn it? Anyway, South Africa has different relations with Russia. Because of that sort of close allyship, if I can say, or close alliance with Russia, how can South Africa help end the war, in your opinion?
South Africa has drawn on its the values that are enshrined in its constitution and a key principle of its foreign policy. Right from the beginning, we've seen South African government officials calling for pursuit of Pacific settlements through dialogue, through diplomacy. At some point, we know that even President Ramaphosa offered the good offices of mediation in terms of mediating that. So in a sense, South Africa has added to the messaging value about peace being offered as an off-ramp in the Russia-Ukraine war, as opposed to what we've seen happening in recent weeks, which has been an escalation of the bellicose rhetoric. And we've seen it appears now, as you correctly stated at the beginning, that both sides of the conflict seem to be digging their heels in. So in a way, South Africa has called for a de-escalation. It's called for a return to dialogue and a return to talks. And that is very much in line with its viewpoint about pushing for dialogue rather than blindly seeking a military solution to the conflict.
Okay. Faith Mabera, foreign policy and geopolitics expert in Pretoria, South Africa. Thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
You're watching DW News Africa. Still to come. We meet farmers in Ghana who have learned a lesson from the war in Ukraine and are now successfully rethinking the way they farm. But first, the war in Ukraine dealt a heavy blow to thousands of African students who were there and were forced to flee. A year later, many are still struggling to readjust to life and studies back home. DW's Isaac Aleji met two medical students in Ghana's capital, Accra.
Prince Danso Tenakwa, living his dream, studying to become a doctor at the prestigious Kharkiv Medical University. But Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed everything. Tenakwa had to flee back home to Ghana. 1 year later, he's still finding it hard to readjust.
It has been very tedious and stressful at a point, because emotionally, if you are not, if you haven't trained yourself emotionally, you end up crying each and every day, because it's not easy, because it's something you never anticipated it will happen.
The Ghanaian government offered to reintegrate the students who left Ukraine into local medical schools. But the offer hasn't been taken up by many. Tenakwa says it would have been too much of a setback, as it didn't recognize the coursework he had already completed. So he's taking part in courses in Ukraine online.
There was an integration, but I mean, literally, I would say it was more traumatizing than even the war itself, because certain categories, you could be in your clinical year, and then after everything, they will tell you, we can only accept you at third year. So literally, that's also a financial burden on the family.
Nana Kwachi Ajimine is also studying to become a doctor. He's one of those who did take up a place at medical school in Ghana. Before that, his parents sponsored him through 5 years of studies at the Bukovina State Medical University in Chernivtsi. He says he enjoyed his time in Ukraine and was close to finishing his degree. Opting to continue his studies in Ghana has cost him time and money.
I had to give up the fact that I'm going to complete school this year and complete school next year. So I was taking a year back, so I'm in level 500 now. So I'm with them. I think that's what I had to do, the only sacrifice I had to make. I had plans, my parents had plans, and this war is taking us a step back. But I think it's quite an experience. I'm embracing it from the positive side of view. So I'm not thinking too much into the negative so that I don't get too affected and not to lose focus. But it's quite sad, very sad.
They were lucky to escape the fighting, but both students also have their regrets about returning to Ghana. Tenakwa hopes the war will end soon so he can return to Ukraine to graduate and start practicing as a doctor.
Farmers across Africa have suffered hikes in fertilizer prices as their components come mainly from Russia and Ukraine. And this has affected their crop yields. But there is a way out. In Ghana, most farmers are now turning to manure as an alternative. The rush for the dung is proving profitable. DW's Maxwell Sook reports from Ghana's northeastern town of Bongpurugu.
Manure has become the proverbial cash cow for cattle breeder Imoro Osumanu. He used to have more dung than he knew what to do with, but Russia's war in Ukraine created a shortage of fertilizers. So the dark deposits his head leaves behind are now selling like hotcakes.
There's a rush on my manure. I can't even meet the demand from the farmers. Some are already ordering now, well ahead of the season. During the plowing period, if you don't manage things well, you can easily go wrong and then not yield the results.
Ghana, like many African countries, usually imports large quantities of ingredients for chemical fertilizers from Russia. However, its war disrupted supplies and farmers are forced to search for homegrown solutions. Staple crops like maize depend heavily on fertilizers, and they have suffered a decline in yields. A large number of smallholder farmers in Ghana are now turning to animal manure produced by livestock breeders as an alternative. This farmer says it is a viable substitute for chemical fertilizers which have become unaffordable.
The war in Ukraine is not over yet. Inorganic fertilizer will remain scarce. That's why I have to be prepared by applying the manure now while we're waiting for the rain. Even if I don't get chemical fertilizers, I won't be bothered.
Ghana's agricultural policy is yet to optimize the integration of livestock and crops. And experts warn that manure can only be a stopgap measure for widespread fertilizer use.
If you want organic manure now, it will be more expensive than inorganic fertilizer because first, the quantities are not there. And then secondly, the work it will require to be able to fertilize large tracts of land is just not conceivable. So it's a long-term thing, but as what is currently going on is a coping strategy.
But cattle breeder Imoro Osumanu isn't just coping. He's hoping to increase the size of his head, looking to make more money from the constant rich supply they deliver every day.